Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jo Curnow. I use she and her pronouns, and I appreciate the land acknowledgements that have gone before. I too am coming from Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota Territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. And the work that I'm talking about today was done in Toronto, which is Mississauga Territory, Haudenosaunee Territory, and part of the Dish with One Spoon, which is, I think, a really useful wampum and way of thinking about the world that helps us to think about stewardship, responsibility, and climate justice in a way that draws on the teachings from the lands and waters of that place. And so hopefully some of those teachings will come through in this very short talk. And I'm happy to talk more about how those things are infused through the work. So I'm sharing a little bit today, very briefly, about work that I have done around politicization, as Andrea noted, based on years of work with youth activists who are working on climate justice. And so you'll see peppered throughout different open access products or openly available things that we've created that are, I think, fun and oriented to making our work accessible and useful to social movements that we are part of. In spring of 2014, Fossil Free U of T launched this massive campaign to get the University of Toronto to divest its fossil fuel holdings, its endowment. And that meant pulling lots of money out of the most intensive, the top 200 fossil fuel companies with the amount of fuel on the ground. So they did this in a way that was largely oriented to bureaucratic process. They donned suits. They put together this massive report, which was open and has been used since to influence a number of other schools and their policy decisions. And they went to the university and said, we'd like you to divest, and here are all of the rational logics for why you should do so, drawing on ideas of fiduciary responsibility, drawing on ideas of the impact, and really making a case for doing that kind of work. They donned suits, they spoke to power brokers, and then they worked over 2 years to try to get the university to divest. So when they went in 2014, one of the key taglines that was used, that was also kind of a joke, was a chant that went, "What do we want? Fossil fuel divestment. When do we want it? Gradually, over 5 years." So for those of you who have experience in social movements, you'll know that this is a joke. Usually the answer is now. And it meant to signal that they were rational, reasonable, and going through the proper channels. Of course, 2 years later, a lot changed. And at that point, we saw a dramatically different student activist group. The students who had been wearing suits 2 years before were now not wearing suits, taking up space in front of Con Hall, which is where the president's office is, pouring black paint down the steps and as an oil spill. And when they use this chant again, "What do we want? Fossil fuel divestment," there's a dramatic shift where they actually oriented themselves to the original chant's logics. When do we want it? Yesterday. The students who had before been very oriented to being polite, to going through proper channels, were fed up. We saw a dramatically different presentation in terms of the demographics of who was speaking and the kinds of bids that they were making when they're talking about the importance of climate. No longer did we hear these technocratic solutions being put forward, but instead we heard people talking about the dramatically different impacts for Indigenous communities, for racialized communities, and we heard a discourse of climate justice that is really significantly different. And so all of our work as a collaborative is oriented to understanding this shift. We ask how activists become politicized, and we look at the dramatic ways that through activism, people became reoriented to what it meant to be doing environmental work. It went from a very mainstream environmentalist framework, which has traditionally been extremely white, traditionally been really technocratic, interested in issues like cap and trade, to something that was really very different and that largely rejected the framework of fossil fuel divestment. So I'm going to shift, that's what like the body of our work focuses on that, and I'm happy to talk about that more, but I'm going to shift to some of the products that have come out of this analysis from this team. Fossil fuel divestment, for people who don't know, is one of the largest student-led campaigns in North America, worldwide, honestly. There's been over 400 campaigns, and this is the campaign that you're most likely to encounter at any North American university. The picture that I am showing here says fossil fuel divestment and has the orange X, which is their logo. This is a comic that we produced as a team that is oriented to climate activists. We made it to take to things like ComicCon and Power Shift, which of course have not happened in the last several years. So the impact of some of our work has not been exactly what we expected when we were developing these open tools. And in the background, it shows Con Hall and the president's office at the University of Toronto, and it shows a pipeline emerging from that building. It has two of the activists then climbing on each other to cut off the flow of oil. And it has Jade, who's the student on top, and one of the Rad Lab members, saying, fossil fuel divestment tries to stop the flow of money from universities to fossil fuel companies. University have endowment funds that are invested in the stock market, and most schools have some of that money wrapped up in the fossil fuel industry. In the foreground, we see Lila, another one of the Rad Lab members and student activists, holding a protest sign that says it's not an investment if it wrecks the planet. And she's saying fossil fuel divestment demands our universities pull our money out of the 200 companies that have the largest reserves of fossil fuels. This goes on as a comic to talk about some of the logics behind fossil fuel divestment, how this became such a big push in North America, and also the limits, the critiques that come out of it through our engagement in the divestment campaign at the University of Toronto, to trace out some of the limitations around justice and solidarity. So Fossil Free U of T was a multi-year campaign. We worked with undergraduates, graduate students, to coordinate a lot of different actions, things like Cookies for Climate Change, talks, things like going door to door, working on this big brief that I mentioned earlier. And all of this worked over these several years to lead to this crowning moment where the university president rejected all of this great work that they had done, rejected work that faculty had done in evaluating the brief. This was a very politicizing moment for many students who thought that the university president would do what was right for students, what was in the best interest of the university and the long-term future students. And so that was very politicizing for many students. And so we try to understand like what counts as politicization. And in a second, I'll talk about that. But just a word about our approach. We orient to Indigenous research methodologies where ideas of relationality are core. We think really deeply about relational accountability, what it means to be accountable to communities that we are embedded in, and to the political commitments of those communities. This aligns really tightly with ideas of militant ethnography, which comes out of anthropology, and which argues that it's not enough to just be like researching a social movement, but you have to have some skin in the game. People who are doing this research work have to be accountable to and embedded in social movements in order to understand what's going on, and to not just be like a voyeur. This calls for really deep commitment in making your work useful to and committed to advancing the goals that come out of social movements, like the self-defined goals. And so the way that we enact that is through a participatory action research approach. And that's why I keep talking about we. This was a team of youth activists who were in the divestment campaign, who came into the campaign really at very different places politically, and then through both the campaign and the research that was layered on top of it, we worked over years to develop an analysis that we think is useful and helpful to use climate activists in thinking about how we do work that is anti-racist, do work that is anti-colonial, do work that advances gender justice, and so that's that is also part of why so much of our work has been oriented to public scholarship, and the open access is a piece of that, because we want the results that we have been thinking with for years to be meaningful, and that means we have to share them with people and share them in a way that is accessible and fun, and not the 50-page paywalled article that we have in the American Educational Research Journal, which is great and not enough. And so that's where a lot of our commitment comes from. So this page is from another product that we came up with, which is a chapter in an edited volume of a comic. Also done, all of the art on this is from Andrew Cohen. And this shows like the key argument that comes out of our analysis around politicization. We found that we had to actually theorize what politicization was before we could get into the nuts and bolts of how it happened, because so much of politicization was like this sniff test where we were like, are they politicized? I don't know. Like, what do we mean? And so we spent a lot of time defining politicization in our work. And so what we found is that it's not just one area. I think people often think of tactics, who's willing to like lock down to something. Those people are rad. But what we found was actually a much more comprehensive transformation process of people shifting what they know, how they know it, what they do, and who they are. In our academic work, we talk about this more around cognition, identity development, epistemological shifts, and the participation and practices that are the key piece of this. But for the public-facing work, we're trying to make it really very accessible. And these 4 areas of change, as you'll see in the art, where we show a woven band with the 4 threads intertwined, and then there's the comic of me in the bottom saying these 4 areas of change were happening all at the same time, and each one strengthened the others. We found that it didn't make any sense to think about them separately. So what we didn't see in these combinations, and this is the text above different activists from our group, one, that people said, oh, we should overthrow patriarchy and capitalism by writing a well-reasoned report based on current science. We didn't also see in the center, activists, let's have a sit-in, but not one of these activist ones. And we also didn't see the third thing, climate change will devastate our communities and we shouldn't do anything drastic. That was not the kind of transformation that we saw. I'm sure for people who are involved in social movements, that doesn't really surprise you. This, just as a pause around open access, this was a chapter in a larger book that I produced with my colleague Tanner Vea, who is at Penn State. We coordinated a workshop with a lot of learning scientists who do work with community activists and with teachers who are doing justice-oriented work called Learning to Engage. And one of the commitments that we all had was making these complex articles accessible to teachers and to the communities that we work in. And so we, as the output of that conference, made this book. It's translating 6 different articles into, I think, way more accessible and pretty fun articles that are comics that reduce the core argument and give context and show in a lot of detail the examples that come out of social movements. And so this has been a really fun piece because we had the funding to mail it to anybody who requested it. So we sent out like 1,000 of these and got really amazing feedback from people who bought a whole set for their classroom and then use it to talk about social movements or to talk about ideas like educational intimacy, which comes from my colleague Suraj Attamchandani, or people who are thinking about the LA teachers strike and the way that the pedagogies of teacher strikes from Josephine Fan and Thomas Phillip. And so we heard about people whose kids stole it and were like reading it for fun. We heard about it was just really nice to see it getting taken up. And we also hear about social movement organizations in a couple of different cities who are using these books as like core texts for them to have conversation about what social movement organizing looks like and how they think about learning as part of their process. We've also made it accessible through Sequentials, which is an online comic and visual arts journal, open access and Creative Commons license. That allowed us to make it accessible to people who we didn't mail these to include accessibility features that we otherwise couldn't. And it was really great to partner with them. And I'm also happy to talk about that. Let me see. Oh, so this is the book. It also let us include like teachers' guides and tools for, this is the cover, and you can see all the different images that are on it. All of them are specific references to specific social movements with, and so if you look at the tools that we have, then you can see the kinds of, you can identify where each picture is like gesturing to and what that social movement history and the organizations that have been part of it are. This is like part of this broader public scholarship commitment that we have. We've also produced work that was published in the Rachel Carson Center journal Perspectives, which is open around the gender dynamics of the group. We also published multiple things in The Conversation Canada, which was actually really powerful in terms of exposure. So one of the pieces that we did was an end of the year roundup. And so it got published in a lot of newspapers because they had all their reporters on vacation. And so it got like a zillion hits, and it meant that we've also gotten a lot of press coverage because of that. So because of that, my colleague Anjali Helferty and I were invited to do some of the press junkets for CBC around the youth climate strikes. And so that meant every 15 minutes we were talking to a different CBC station across Canada, like all day. And it's a really interesting opportunity. And since then, I think we've had a lot more interest from press in talking about the findings of our work and calling on us as experts in youth organizing and climate work. I think maybe I will try to wrap up. So I think our overall commitment to knowledge mobilization as a team has been making sure that any of the work that we're doing is accessible to the activists that we work with, and that we think about the activist scholars that we are in a network with as needing to understand and see and participate and respond to all the work that we're doing. Our work needs to be relevant to the community activists that we're doing, and it needs to be rooted in relationships in our movements. And so that's what we've been striving for, and that is why open and Creative Commons work has been so important to us. And so I think I will just leave it at that.